Thunder rolled like a broken promise across the desert sky. The kind that made even the earth seem to tremble under its sorrow. Samuel Hart pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, the rain slicing sideways through the dusk. He had been riding since dawn, chasing silence more than direction, carrying the kind of emptiness that doesn't echo anymore, it just waits. The plains stretched endless before him, but it wasn't the land that made him feel small. It was the memory of what he'd lost, a home burned down in a lightning storm, a brother buried under the same roof. Since that night, he'd spoken little and trusted even less. The storm cracked again, and that's when he saw her, barely a shape at first, huddled against a broken wagon wheel. The wind tore at her blanket, revealing skin pale with cold and eyes half shut in surrender. She was old, impossibly fragile, her breath shallow as if each one cost more than she could afford. Samuel reined in his horse, hesitating. He'd learned that mercy could be a dangerous thing in the wild. But something in the stillness of her face, a peace that looked like defiance, held him there. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. The woman's lips moved faintly, words tangled between worlds. She was whispering to someone who wasn't there, perhaps someone she'd loved long before he was born. When he knelt, her gaze flickered open, catching him like a spark in the rain. "Water," she breathed, the syllable barely a ghost. He gave her the last of his canteen. Her hands trembled but didn't spill a drop. Her fingers were small and cracked, but she drank with the grace of a queen reclaiming her dignity. Then, as if remembering herself, she whispered, "You are far from your people, White Rider." "So are you," he murmured, unsure why he answered at all. The rain softened to a whisper, and he built a small fire from wet twigs, coaxing life out of smoke. She watched him without fear. When the warmth found her face, she spoke again, words coming slow, like someone unburying old truths. Her name was Nita. Once she had a husband, a hunter who never came home from a raid. Once she had a daughter, Ayana, who went to the mission town to trade herbs for bread and never returned. "Maybe she forgot," Nita said, though her voice betrayed no anger, only the acceptance of someone who had waited too long to hate anymore. Samuel said nothing. He just listened. The flames painted her in soft gold, and for a moment, he saw not an old woman but the faint shape of the girl she must have been. Bright, fierce, unyielding. The fire snapped, and her eyes lifted toward the storm's dying clouds. "The land remembers kindness," she said. "Even when people forget." He didn't understand, but he felt it, the strange weight of her words, as though she were not thanking him, but binding him to something unseen. That night, he stayed by her side in a half-collapsed barn they found nearby. Rain tapped the roof like fingertips. He didn't sleep, only watched her rest. She murmured names in her tongue, and once she reached out in her dreams, touching the empty air. When dawn crept in, painting the world in soft amber, her breathing steadied. He helped her to the nearby settlement, a small patch of cabins and prayer bells. Sister Ruth, the widow who kept away station for travelers, took Nita in without question. Samuel stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand, unsure what to say. The old woman grasped his wrist, her grip surprisingly firm. Her eyes gleamed with a knowing far too deep for words. "The wind told me you would come," she said. "And it tells me this: you will not walk alone much longer." He started to protest, but she only smiled, the kind of smile that closes a story instead of beginning one. Then she turned away, letting the nun lead her inside. Samuel rode off, the sound of his horse fading into the hush of morning. Yet her words followed him like a shadow that refused to fall behind. Weeks slipped into months. The desert bloomed and withered again. Samuel took work with the railmen, hammering iron through the bones of the earth. Nights, he sat by the fire, rolling a coin through his fingers, wondering why he kept thinking of an old woman who might already be gone. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps something deeper. One day, Sister Ruth came riding through the camp. Her shawl was dusted with sand, her eyes heavy with distance. She handed him a folded scrap of paper, its edges browned with age. Inside, in a shaky hand, were words that chilled him more than the wind. "My daughter will come for you when the snows melt." He looked up, heart uneasy. What does this mean? Sister Ruth only sighed. She said it was a promise, not a warning. Spring came like a soft apology. The snows melted from the hills, leaving trails of water that glistened like veins in the earth. One evening, as Samuel mended his saddle, he saw movement along the ridge. A rider approached slowly, the sun setting behind her like a halo of flame. She was young, no older than 28, with dark hair that caught the dying light and eyes that didn't waver. Her horse bore the painted marks of her people, feathers tied to its mane. When she stopped before him, he rose to meet her, heart caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. "My mother spoke of you," she said, her voice low and steady. "She said you saved her life." Samuel's throat tightened. She made it? The woman shook her head. "She walked on with the ancestors when the winter came." A pause, long and heavy. "But before she left, she made me promise to find you." He took off his hat, grief folding through him like dust in the wind. "I'm sorry for your loss." She studied him for a moment, eyes unreadable. Then she said softly, almost tenderly, "She told me, now I'm yours." The words hung between them, fragile and wild, and the evening wind carried the last echo of thunder away. The wind carried gunfire before the sound could be named. 3 shots, fast and mean, slicing through the dusk. Samuel dropped his coffee tin and reached for his revolver, heart cracking open with instinct more than thought. Dust rose where the horses stopped. 3 men, drunk on whiskey and cruelty, eyes already full of trouble. Ayanna froze beside the fire, the glow painting her in defiant bronze. Samuel stepped forward, the muzzle of his gun low, voice even. "You're on private land." The tallest one spat. "Ain't no land private when it's got an Indian woman camped on it." The others laughed, sharp as broken glass. Ayanna said nothing. Her gaze didn't flinch, though her fingers trembled slightly against the edge of her shawl. Samuel moved closer to her without thinking, his presence a wall. He had lived through storms and fire, but never had he felt the kind of anger that burned cold, not hot. "You'll leave now," he said, calm as winter. The men smirked, mistaking calm for fear. The one on the left cocked his pistol. "Or what? You her keeper." Samuel didn't answer. The fire hissed as the first raindrops began to fall, small and uncertain. He could feel Ayanna's breath behind him, steady, waiting. When the man raised his gun, Samuel fired first. One shot cracked the night open. The man dropped, not dead, but screaming into the mud. The others hesitated, long enough for Samuel to grab Ayanna's hand. "Run," he hissed. They fled into the dark, rain washing the gunpowder from their skin. His shoulder burned, a grazing shot, but it bled freely. They didn't stop until the thunder swallowed the world again. Only then did Ayanna pull him into a hollow beneath a rock ledge, forcing him to sit. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to the wound. Her touch was sure, her silence louder than fear. He tried to speak, but she shook her head. "You should not have fought for me," she whispered finally. Her voice cracked on the word, me, as if she didn't believe she was worth the risk. He closed his eyes, grimacing. "I didn't fight for you," he said quietly. "I fought because men like that should be stopped." She smiled faintly, a shadow of something too old to be happiness. "Then maybe we both understand mercy the same way." They stayed hidden till dawn, the storm fading into memory. When the light returned, the desert looked washed clean. Samuel's shoulder throbbed, but the bleeding had slowed. Ayanna sat beside him, watching the horizon, eyes unreadable. "You'll be hunted now," she said softly. "They'll call you killer." He gave a dry laugh. "They already did, long before tonight." She turned to him then, her gaze cutting straight through. "My mother told me you carried sorrow like a horse carries dust, always there, even when the rain falls. But she said sorrow can be shared. That's why she sent me." Samuel looked away. "She said that?" "Yes," Ayanna murmured. "She said you'd given her back her life. And I was to give you back yours." The words hit harder than the bullet. He wanted to argue, to say he didn't need saving, but her eyes silenced him. Instead, he reached for the torn fabric at his shoulder, her handiwork stained with his blood. "You think this is how people find life again?" he asked, almost bitterly. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Sometimes you bleed for it. Sometimes you wait for someone who won't run when they see the blood." The quiet stretched, soft and endless. He realized then that she wasn't there to repay a debt. She was there to remind him that mercy had roots, that one act of kindness could grow into something vast and alive. The understanding settled between them, unspoken but certain. When they returned to camp, everything was as they had left it, except the silence. The fire still smoldered. The blood in the dirt had dried to rust. Ayanna gathered her few belongings and tied them to her horse. Samuel watched her, uncertain if she was leaving or beginning. "Where will you go?" he asked finally. She looked toward the hills, where the sky opened into pale blue. "Where you go," she said simply. He frowned. "You don't owe me that." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. "You still don't understand," she whispered. "My mother didn't send me to repay you. She sent me to finish what you started, to make sure the man who saves others learns to save himself." Samuel didn't know what to say. His throat felt full, his pulse loud. He thought of the storm, the fire, the loss that had shaped him. He thought of Nita's eyes as she'd said, "You will not walk alone." He hadn't believed her then. But standing before Ayanna, he began to wonder if promises like that didn't belong to time at all, only to souls that refused to let each other vanish. The wind picked up again, stirring the ashes at their feet. Ayanna reached out, took his wounded hand in hers, and pressed it against her heart. "Now you understand," she said. "Now we are both bound by mercy." The horizon shimmered with heat, the air trembling as if the world itself were listening. Samuel exhaled, a sound halfway between surrender and peace. In that fragile silence, the future felt like something that could be rewritten. Then, faint but unmistakable, the echo of distant hoofbeats rolled over the plain. More riders, coming fast. Ayanna turned her head toward the sound, her fingers still entwined with his. Neither spoke, but both knew. Mercy had found them once. Now, it would be tested.